Hello, and welcome to the Southcoast Artists Index, where artists, performers, and writers, as well as curators, directors, and supporters, anyone with ties to the creative community, drops by to introduce themselves to you. We'll talk about their beginnings, their vision, their passion, and so much more. The Southcoast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com.
Hi, this is Ron Fortier again with another episode of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the Artist Index and sponsored by Heavenly Spirits, importers of fine French spirits. That's where the heavenliness and the spiritness comes from. Without further ado, our next guest, someone I've been wanting to speak with for a long time because we both worked in the same place, but not exactly at the same time, almost like two ships passing in the night. And I will let her introduce herself and spell her name for the historic record.
Okay, good morning. My name is Peggy, P-E-G-G-I, Medeiros, M-E-D-E-I-R-O-S. And I am a historian, and I'm just pitching my third book to my publisher.
That's fantastic. So you're a historian, writer, scholar. Yeah. Okay. So let's turn back the hands of time to where did this all begin? Was this something that came about prior to your employment at New Bedford City Hall? And if you could give us a little bit of background on how that came to be.
Well, it actually dates back to then. I was looking for work, and I heard they were hiring research people for the Office of Historic Preservation. So I applied and I got the job, and I fell in love with New Bedford history. It really fascinated me, and I've been involved with it ever since.
Are you originally from New Bedford, or are you a Fall River girl, as they?
I'm a Dartmouth girl.
You're a Dartmouth girl. Okay.
I'm a Dartmouth girl, but now I live in Somerset.
Okay. All right. Yeah, because I saw the caller ID, it said Fall River on it. So that was the assumption. I was at the Office of Historic Preservation, working for Tony Souza, as you had worked for him. Straight out of graduate school. I was also the assistant office manager for the Historic Building Survey that was running. It was a counterpart to the Office of Historic Preservation. And wow, I think we both got bit by the same history bug. I mean, the city of New Bedford is just phenomenal. It's rife with history.
It's one of the most interesting cities I know. I joke I can link New Bedford to just about anyone.
And anywhere.
Anywhere. The only person I couldn't find a direct link to was Alexander Hamilton. He never came to New Bedford.
Really?
But when he died, New Bedford rang the church bells.
I mean, we had notorious people, notaries, celebrities, you name it, all were here at some point in time.
Well, it makes sense. We were the richest city in the world per person because of whaling, twice, and then the second time because of textiles.
Wow. So what is the most amazing piece of information that you came across when you were doing research for the city? I know the one that made my jaw drop was, well, I was privileged. I mean, my name's on those.
I've seen your name on them.
Yeah. Carl Simmons, who Michael Lapides from the Whaling Museum and I we are going to kidnap him and get him on this show. He'll be a wealth of information. But one of the things was going into what is now the Nathaniel and Polly Johnson house, where Frederick Douglass stayed when he first came to Freedom. Mrs. Haney, who was the owner at the time, she was the former manager of the New Bedford Steamship Authority. I think she was the first woman manager of that organization. She gave us the tour and such. That was a thrill. But then I was doing some research in the library, the New Bedford Public Library, and I was just hitting a wall, and I decided that I was going to tidy up some of the file drawers because people had left them a mess. So I started tidying up this file drawer, and I found a cache of letters that was absolutely astounding. It was about a southern planter named Patrick Gibson, who owned a plantation in Savannah Isle, Georgia, and the abolitionist network, so to speak, and this was fairly early, I believe this was in the 1840s, the abolitionist network, and almost like the spy ring on how they got this planter's enslaved wife and their children, to use the term mulatto children, up to New Bedford for her to be primed and educated so that she could enter polite white society anywhere under the British flag, because at the time, Britain, I believe it was 1830.
Outlawed slavery.
Yes, exactly. The abolition. So that was a thrill. Anything similar that you ran across? And I'm sure, I mean, there had to be tons.
The one that really made my jaw drop was, most people don't realize it, but the Rotch Jones Duff House and Garden Museum came very, very close to being bought by someone who wanted to turn it into a bar.
Oh, God.
And a whole group of us in the neighborhood, headed up by Jim Henry, the attorney who's no longer with us, got involved in fighting it. We found Whale, who agreed to buy the property, and then it spun off. But while I was researching, because nobody had done a lot of research on the house, I found an architect for the house, because everyone just assumed it had been built, by a carpenter. Turned out that Richard Upjohn, who was considered the father of American architecture, designed the Rotch Jones Duff House. It was his first major building.
Wow.
And that really made my jaw drop, and it gave the history of the house even more importance.
There was one of my father's customers was a Mrs. Power. I believe the Power or Powers were married into the Duffs. She was quite interesting. She had a lot of artifacts in the apartment, and spoke about the house quite frequently when we go there to do our weekly cleaning. And it's kind of amazing that here she was. I mean, she was in her 80s at that time. This is before it became a museum. And here's this living piece of information, this treasure trove, right across the street from the house.
I actually got to meet Mrs. Duff.
You did?
When I was working for Tony, she invited the office up to see the house, which was wonderful. And so we met her. She talked to us about the house. We had a tour from the attic to the cellar, because she had a houseman who took us through. She was strong enough. So that was a real thrill to see what the house looked like when she lived there.
It was practically untouched, wasn't it?
It was very untouched. She had a grand piano in the living room, one of the double parlors. And on top, she made as a hobby copies of Fabergé Easter eggs. And she had her eggs out on the top of the piano.
Wow, that's interesting.
And I know she loved the house. She grew to love the house. Mark Duff, her husband, who was the richest banker in New Bedford at the time,
right,
was a very he made his own decisions, and he never bothered to ask anybody about it. I mean, he literally came home one day and told his wife he bought the house.
There's a story about him too, with the Duff building. They did that complete remodel on it, and that caused a bit of a kerfuffle, didn't it?
I think so. I don't know the details on it.
Yeah.
But I know he was a force to be reckoned with in New Bedford.
Now, rather than just go down memory lane, in history, which is there's nothing wrong with that. I want to get back to you primarily, but another thing that popped in my head was a Mrs. Anthony. I remember doing deed research on the property. It was off the county street. It wasn't too far away from the Rotch Jones Duff House. She was a young widow. I think she was only 27, and her story is very parallel to the Veuve Clicquot, Madame Clicquot, who she took over her husband's champagne business and made sure that Napoleon's line of supply of their champagne was never interrupted. But both young widows and both women being attacked by marauders trying to usurp their power or just plain out steal everything from under them. And Mrs. Anthony, on the day of her wedding, her husband had built a whale ship and launched it. They went, after the wedding, they went up into the bedroom, and she witnessed the launching of the whale ship from her bedroom window. And then it was his death, his untimely death, and what she did to protect all of her property and her other resources, her financial resources. Did you ever run across her?
Anthony, was that the Granite Mansion on County Street?
I believe it was.
Street.
Yeah.
Yeah, he died young. He left a diary.
Did he?
Yeah, which I used to have a copy of. I don't have it now anymore, but he was a very interesting man, and he writes about his wife, what they did, what life was like in New Bedford when they were very young, because he was pretty young when he died.
Yeah. She was a force to be reckoned with. She was very intelligent, and what she did with the straw men, where she had a couple of comrades in arms, so to speak, that would buy the property and then flip it over to her, back to her, totally blowing away any and all comers who were going to try to sweep the property away from her. There's a book for you right there, Peggy.
Yeah, you're right.
and
the house was wonderful. The shame is that it was demolished.
Yeah.
After her death, it was bought by a member of the Roosevelt family who lived there. And I think Franklin was her nephew. And when one of the rooms in the house on the third floor was a marble floored gymnasium. And it was spectacular. Unfortunately, she died during the late 1930s with absolutely no money. She was broke, and the house was sold and knocked down for the land.
I mean, I remember as a child when my mother moved back from New York, and we lived at 327 County Street, which was restored a couple of years. It's probably been maybe 10 years ago now. It's on the corner of Allen and County.
Okay. Yeah, I do know the house.
And I believe it was a Brown's Pharmacy on the first floor. Career and Sons was a big Portuguese emporium, furniture emporium on the other side. But the point being is that stretch within less than a mile of County Street, the amount of history on that street alone is phenomenal. From the Grinnell Mansion and all of the Grinnell things to the fact that Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, was a frequent visitor.
He had his first drink at the Grinnell Mansion.
Yeah, and his road to perdition began there, so to speak.
It was during World War I. He was stationed at the fort.
Yeah.
And the Grinnell family invited young officers up and had receptions for them, and that's how he ended up in the Grinnell Mansion.
Yeah, I read the book Bill W, and I believe one of the passages was the Grinnell girls were known to celebrate into the small hours of the morning or whatever it was. I mean, that was the one house on the block that was always lit up at night, mostly through the night too. So let's get back to now to your authorship. What was your first book?
My first book was New Bedford Mansions. And what I did was I divided the families I was interested into houses, the way they divide whaling houses. So it was the House of Roach, the House of Grinnell, right through. And I covered a good part of, I wrote about just about all of the mansions that I was interested in. And then my second book, Harriet Jacobs in New Bedford, which came out just as the pandemic was hitting, came from the fact that Harriet Jacobs was the only slave who ever wrote an autobiography. And it was published, but the connection to New Bedford was with the Grinnell family.
Yeah, there's the Grinnells were even connected to Michigan. One of them was the governor of Michigan.
Actually, that was Crapo.
Was it Crapo? Oh, that's
Yeah,
it.
it's
Okay.
Crapo.
As soon as the words left my mouth, I was like, oh, I think you just stepped in that one. But anyway,
Grinnell was a congressman.
That's right, he was.
And he was a friend of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And he was present. John Quincy Adams joined the House of Congress after being president, which was very unusual. And he served for a number of years, and he collapsed and died on the floor of Congress. And Joseph Grinnell caught him as he collapsed.
Wow.
So it's a very interesting family.
Yeah. What stimulated you? What drove you to write your first book?
My first book, I'd always wanted to write a book, and the chance came up to write for the History Press. So I took it and ran with it, and enjoyed doing it. They're very good to write for.
Okay.
And they publish very nicely. Their books are well done.
Yeah, I have a friend of mine in Chicago. His name is Lowell Thompson. He's one of the old ad men of the, back in the Mad Men days of Chicago, and also I believe if not the first, one of the first African American ad people. And he worked for them. He published a book, The History of African Americans in Chicago. And he's been, peddling his book, and he's been doing quite well. I mean, I remember when they first came out, the first time I saw them, they were these thin little books, like in gift shops and such, that were mostly pictorial books, very, very little text, mostly all pictures. And, they were interesting. I didn't know how much they could be trusted because, I really didn't know about them, but they've been around for quite a while.
They are, their overall owner is the Arcadia Press, which actually is a British firm, which they don't mention very often, but it is.
That's why when I Googled the History Press, it kept throwing me to the UK, and I'm like, no, that's not what I put down.
That's the reason.
Yeah. Now let's speak about Ona Judge, and before that, I'm sorry, Harriet Jacobs. Ona Judge popped into my head because she was the one slave that gave George Washington nightmares.
Yes, she ran away. She disappeared.
Did she actually ended up in New Bedford for a short while, didn't she?
I don't know about New Bedford. I believe she ended up in New Hampshire.
Okay.
And Washington never found her.
Yeah, she was quite incredible. In fact, one of the things that if I had time, the Black history of New Bedford would be like phenomenal, with the amount of I tell friends from in Detroit about what we have here. It was an abolitionist center, so on and so forth, and nearly everything that had to do with abolition and the Civil War ended up here. And you almost feel like it's your line. You're like a used car salesman trying to pitch somebody on something. But this is a truly amazing spot on the map.
It is, and the connection with Harriet, because just Harriet Jacobs alone wouldn't have given me a book. But it turned out that Harriet was enslaved. She was in the South. Her master was abusive, And she actually, to keep away from him, she hid in her grandmother's attic for 7 years and eventually escaped north and eventually brought her 2 children with up from the South to be with her. But she went to work for Cornelia Grinnell, Joseph Grinnell's adopted daughter, and eventually Harriet told her that she was an escaped slave. She trusted Harriet. Harriet trusted her. And when the slave master came looking for Harriet in New York, Cornelia sent her to New Bedford to the Grinnell mansion, along with her child, because as Harriet was told, if you're taken, the news will come out that a white child was with you, and I'll know what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so Cornelia then bought Harriet's freedom, which is just amazing. And
Yankee
Harriet,
common sense, huh?
Yankee common sense. And Harriet was in New Bedford a lot.
Wow.
And remained very close to the Grinnell family for her entire life.
Was it the Quakers? I keep saying to myself, "Oh, don't ask another history question." It's about, but it's so hard to stop. It's like salted peanuts. Was it because of the Quakers that I can say I was born in New Bedford. We were such an abolitionist center.
I think the Quakers had a lot to do with it. Because if you look at the history of New Bedford, you can go back to the early days when William Rotch Jr. was still alive, and he helped to shelter slaves who escaped north. So it was something that was sort of bred in New Bedford and continued.
Wow.
And I think the Quakers had a lot to do with it, the religion.
Yeah. So let's go back again. You were working as a researcher for the Office of Historic Preservation. What were your qualifications for that? I mean, background, education, that kind of thing.
I went to UMass Dartmouth and I majored in English and art history. So technically, the writing helped.
Yeah.
English helped.
No, that's actually
That was my
an excellent double major.
It's fun.
Yeah. So from there, you got bit by the bug severely by what you kept uncovering. Where did you go after the Office of Historic Preservation? Because unfortunately, when the new administration came in, the Office of Historic Preservation went out.
I went to work for Whale.
Okay.
I went from working for Tony Souza to working for John Bullard.
Wow.
And at that time, Whale was was doing 2 major projects. They were doing the Zeiterian Theater,
mm-hmm.
and they were doing the Rotch Jones Duff House, because initially Whale bought the mansion and helped to raise money and set up what became the Board of Governors
mm-hmm.
for it. So there were 2 major projects ongoing at the time, and that's what I worked on.
Right. Another one of those moments was having the opportunity to sit and speak with Barney Zeitz of the Zeiterian. That was a thrill and a half. There's living history right there. And told us the story of the press that they had to create because of a roof collapse in a theater somewhere in New England. It was close enough to cause people to be concerned by being in large, open, unsupported spaces. But now, so from Whale, working with John Bullard, and you had those 2 projects. Where did you go from there?
I went to Swain School.
You went to the Swain School?
I went to work at Swain School.
Oh, okay.
I was there. I took care of Swain at that point, had 7 historic buildings. So I worked on the historic buildings, raising money for them. And I also took over the Crapo Gallery. So that was great fun.
You've had like some really cool jobs.
I actually have. They don't pay very much, but I've had some really cool jobs.
Really? I mean, we're talking about keystone kind of positions, keystones in history, in the great arch of history. Was Rosalind Lincoln still at the Swain when you were there?
I think she was on the board.
Okay,
I met her at different times, but I can't tell you exactly when.
right. Myron Owen.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that was another one of my dad's accounts. And this was obviously prior to, and I don't know how that happened because I think I went away to grad school at that point. But Myron Owen and his wife were still living there. Myron Owen's art collection was staggering. Margaret, the housekeeper, used to tell me, "Don't be so impressed because there's like three times more of this stuff is floating all over the country on loan." And then Mrs. Owen's bedroom was floor to ceiling Russian icons.
Wow.
Yeah, it was just absolutely phenomenal. And do you know the story about how it transitioned from the Owens? And what do you know about the Owens and how the property transitioned over to Swain
Which property was this?
on Madison Street?
Oh, the Madison
That's
Street.
that's the one that had the copper North Light studio. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know the story. I knew the building. I
Mhm.
actually had an office in there for a while when it became the Swain Library. It was a beautiful library.
Yeah, it was a beautiful building. And my father kind of hated it, when we would go there because Margaret would just pull me away knowing I was an art student.
Oh, wow.
And seriously, I mean, every week we'd go there, there was more. It was like it was never repetitive. So my father just gave up and he just adjusted his schedule as such, and we took it from there. So that's interesting. Now, again, you're in a key position situation in history. It's modern history, but it's still history. You're at the Swain School. What was going on with the School of Artisanry? All those
While I
things.
was there, the program in artistry from Boston University transferred down, which is one of the great programs. People don't realize how important that program is with ceramics and fiber and glass and everything else. And it still exists through UMass Dartmouth, but that was going on. Swain at one point actually looked at the Grinnell Mansion and was thinking of buying it to have the program in artisanry restore it. But the Catholic Church wasn't ready to sell at that point, so it didn't work out. And then Swain decided, or the president and the board, in effect, closed it down and merged Swain with UMass Dartmouth.
That was Yenawayne, was it?
Yeah, Bruce Yenawayne, which I thought was a terrible thing. And I actually left at that point. I didn't want anything to do with it.
Yeah, on that note, I keep going back to I can feel the pain of the Swain students. Nearly everything has been obliterated. But there's still, there's still a lot of the buildings as reminders that still exist, obviously. But the camaraderie, the incredible vibrancy, everything that filled those buildings.
Oh yeah, anyone who went to Swain is still very close.
It's almost like veterans.
Yeah, in fact, Gallery X grew out of Swain School. Just about everyone involved with Gallery X went to Swain.
Yeah.
It's a group unlike any other where they have kept in touch.
Yeah. When I left what was SMU, Southeastern Massachusetts University, in '75, what is now CVPA, the College of Visual and Performing Arts, was a hole in the ground. In fact, up till I think our graduation, there was no college. We were just a department, I believe, in arts and sciences. And so for us, it's taken forever to, we were like stepchildren as well. It took us forever to say, University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. It was just like a mental block. So we went to SMU. The only aggravation.
I did too.
Yeah, the only aggravation we had was having to say no, not Southern Methodist. Although that's a very nice school. But there's there's a couple of things that are running parallel here. There's this incredible history that comes from the Swain School of Design, its background, the leading personages of New Bedford, and then transfers its way into a university within a state system, the University of Massachusetts system. But there are other things of historic note that occurred as well. Can you just give us like an overview, from your own personal, opinion of what you've seen it transpire?
At that time, well, I've seen New Bedford grow into a real city of arts and history. It's no secret that we are now a poor city. And the two strands that are really helping are art and history. I don't know if you've seen the New Bedford Light, which is the new newspaper. Yes. This morning they had a piece about the water project that's going on all over the downtown and up and down into the national park. If anything will bring attention and money to New Bedford, it's taking care of working with the arts and history.
Yeah, exactly.
That's because there aren't any other. I mean, the largest single employer in New Bedford is, I believe, St. Luke's Hospital.
Right.
And after that, the city.
Yeah. I think that the creative community, the arts industry, is the city's bona fide third major industry, from whaling to textiles to the arts industry is now, I think, a major industry in the history of New Bedford, because if you look at how everything transpired, there's definitely connections, from shares of whale ships. That mindset in business was brought over to shares in textiles. Those buildings, those massive buildings, of which we've lost a good amount.
Far too many of the mills are gone.
Would you say we hit 50% on loss of those buildings?
I'm not sure. I know the one that I was the most angry about was Fairhaven Mills.
Yeah.
Which had an incredible history. Lewis Hine had photographed children working there, and there was no excuse for it.
No. It started off as a silk mill, I believe.
Yeah, it had an enormously important history.
Yeah.
And if any mill was saved, that should have been the one that was saved, along with I think, one or two of the Wamsutta mills that are still left, that are housing now.
Yeah. The mills themselves, I mean, as transition from textiles, which is a whole nother story about how New Bedford Tech and New Bedford Tech pretty much trained the best and the brightest for the southern textile industry that was going to eventually just overlap the Northeast, and then everything that being exported overseas and such. And then the apparel industry came in, and I mean, we had world-class labels being created here in the city. I mean, chemise Lacoste, which was a rage in the 70s, remember? And 80s, was produced here in Riverside, the Riverside manufacturing. And but when they started to move out, it's kind of interesting that we've had two of the mills. We have Hatch Street in the North End.
Right, which
go ahead.
I was going to say, I have friends who are artists who have studios at Hatch Street.
Yeah, that was one of my dad's accounts as well. So I said, "My God, did he clean the whole city?" I said, "Yep, he cleaned the whole city." The Dritz was there, and so they did notions for the hobbyist and sewer, I guess you want to call it, stitcher, seamstress, and also for the industry itself. And so now we have that entity, which at one time there's like 65 artists there alone, which has to say something. I mean,
certainly does.
It's just that building. And then the Kilburn Mill, which
I haven't been down since it's been gone through the changes.
Yeah, it's been something else. I mean, coincidentally, the story, I've mentioned this on the podcast. Luis Villanueva, friend gallerist and such, tells me he gets a phone call telling him he had to vacate his gallery on Center Street because the building had been sold. So he's like, "What do I do?" And I said, "I don't know." I said, "But I've been speaking to one of my dad's other accounts. I was speaking with Steve Lefkowitz of Furniture City, and I had known him from NFIB, the National Federation for Independent Business, of which one of my cousins was one of the oldest members in the country, I think, Florence Boisvert. And we were talking about this, that, and the other. And Steve is saying, the furniture business has gone stupid. They've tried every gimmick in the world. His brother Larry wanted nothing to do with it, and he didn't know what to do. So I said, well, you've got a couple of artists upstairs, like Jim Charette of the Gunbolt Gallery, and Rainey Gagné, I think, was up there as well. Zach Meunier was up there. And so there's a motley crew, so to speak. He unfortunately became ill, sold the building, and now I believe it's the Murrays who bought the building, and they want to create, basically it's an art mall. There's no other way to refer to it, as a model, where they have entertainment venue, they have amenities such as a restaurant. There's a brewery that's ready to go. And they have artists' studios in there. And I think they've actually succeeded in making the South End a destination, because that's always been the problem with the business in the South End. You serviced those in the South End, on the point. But pretty much other than that, you really would have to have something that people would want to drive all the way down there for.
When the Whaling Museum exhibited the mural, it was at the Kilburn Mill, I believe. I went several times. I wish that they had been able to leave it there, because it's in storage now.
I thought it was at the Seaport, Mystic Seaport.
Yeah. Oh, that's right.
Yeah, because I was laughing. They took Christina away, the curator.
Yeah.
they took Achaia, and now they've got the panorama.
But it doesn't belong to them.
I know. It's only on loan.
It was perfect on Kilburn Street. That would have been a major draw if they had left it there.
Yeah, in fact, it could have almost been a de facto extension of the museum off property.
It would have been brilliant.
Yeah.
But they didn't take my advice on that one.
Yeah, that happens, right? So really trying to get back now into your literary career. What's next?
Well, right now I'm writing actually a proposal to the history press to do a book on the Jones family of New Bedford, who were the second owners of the Rotch Jones Duff House. Members of the family owned that house for 85 years. And it went from Captain Edward Coffin Jones, who had 3 little girls after his wife died, and he raised them, to Amelia Jones, who was an amazing philanthropist. She was responsible for Solomar Hospital for Children, which most people don't know about now, but it was a major undertaking. And the idea of Solomar was sun and sea. And one thing I love about it is that Captain Jones's wife grew up in Portugal. And that's where Amelia heard this term sun and sea. So I think it will make a terrific book. So I'm putting the proposal together to
Solimar. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I never knew that. I lived on Prospect Street in Dartmouth, and Solimar was just down pretty much way down the street. They had the Carmelite nuns down there as well.
Right.
And I always wondered, Solimar, it's Portuguese, but it for some reason it didn't register as Portuguese because it was kind of a Yankee community, No,
it was an amazing place. The idea was it took children without regard for money. Initially, they were children who had orthopedic problems. And the idea was that the sun and the sea would help heal them. And they had a teacher there. The history of Solomar is amazing.
Wow.
And when I was growing up, it was still hanging on, and they were taking care of children who had contracted polio. Because when I was little, it was just before the polio vaccine, and polio was still a nightmare.
Right. I still remember it seemed like every week I was being stuck with something.
Yeah, once the vaccine came in.
For some
They
reason
gave it to us at school.
what was that?
They gave it to us at school.
I don't remember that. I do remember there were several different buildings, where I went, and it seemed like I said, I'm like every weekend or something bizarre like that in my childhood memory. But every time I go by on Rivet Street, the Monsignor Vieira, that
Oh, yes.
it still stings,
Monsignor Vieira was responsible for my parents being married at St. Martin's Episcopal Church.
Oh, really?
And there were a whole generation of men and women who could not stand Monsignor Vieira, who were married at St. Martin's.
Yeah.
And I had a friend who was a minister there, and she said, why were all of these Catholics being married here?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The story.
I mean, I went to Immaculate Conception, and so it was a kinder, gentler parochial school education there. It was the Sisters of Jesus and Mary, and Monsignor Arcibal Branco, Father Branco. He was, I was an altar boy there for my duration, of going to school there. It was totally different. And then going to a French Canadian parish of St. Anne's in the South End, that was like one of those nightmare kind of things where you had those personalities that they ruled with an iron fist, and it's just sort of crazy. It's too bad. Speaking of churches, as an art historian and as a writer, does it bother you or give you nightmares of all of the houses of worship that are closing and going into disrepair and being torn down for a police station?
I'm really worried about the Unitarian Church.
Really?
Which has very little money and needs a huge amount of work. And it's a very small congregation now. It's not a wealthy church any longer.
Yeah.
So I worry about them. And I hate the Catholic Church. It didn't help any with the number of their churches by not allowing different uses.
Yeah, exactly.
They basically said they would rather a church were demolished than that it were reused.
Yeah. And then even with the reuse, I mean, there's only so many theaters, restaurants. I think probably one of the best examples I've seen is right here in Fairhaven. The original, I think it was a Congregational church. It's a wooden structure building. They turned it into apartments, and it took me, several walks by until I noticed, hey, wait a minute, these are apartments. It was really, really well done. They just kept the character of the church from the exterior completely. If you had a magic wand and you could write about anything that you wanted to, especially something that really, been tugging at you for years and years and years, what would that be?
Well, the Joneses have been tugging at me for years. I've been intrigued by them, so I'm hoping that will come to pass. I would eventually like to do something. I'm on the board of the Dartmouth Heritage Preservation Trust, which takes care of the Aiken House in Dartmouth.
Yeah, that was on top of Meriden and Merrimack. I'm dyslexic, so I can.
It's an amazing building, and it's been restored. COVID kind of knocked off all our programming for it, but I would like to do a book on the house. It has a great history. It was built in 1786, I think.
Yeah, I used to walk by because that was in my neighborhood in Dartmouth, coming up from Prospect to Dartmouth Street. And it was amazing. Well, it was an amazingly good repair visually from the outside, except for that slope in the roof, but you would expect a building of that age to have been totally, falling apart. just on, a passerby inspection kind of a thing. And then it was great to hear that they started that restoration.
Well, it was lived in until the mid 1980s, but by
Really?
the time, and it's really tiny for a family.
Yeah.
There were
I tell you the
children
truth,
who
I never knew anyone lived in that building.
They did live in their building. They had children who had their bedrooms in the attic, but it was in real disrepair when first Whale and then my group took it over.
Yeah.
I mean,
Wow.
the roof had been leaking, ceilings had collapsed. It was just a disaster.
I mean, it looked derelict, or abandoned when I was, in the neighborhood. So that's a shock to me. Wow. A quick question. Jones Beach in Dartmouth, is that named after any of the Joneses of New Bedford?
I believe it's named for Amelia Jones.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right.
Solomar had originally been the Jones family farm.
Mhm.
Most of the families in New Bedford had their own farms in Dartmouth where they grew vegetables and had cows and everything else.
Right. That's interesting.
It made sense. And Solomar was originally the Jones family farm. And then it became Solomar Hospital. But I'm trying to think of the other families who had, it's amazing the number of families who had farms in Dartmouth.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of buildings, like just doing a quick sweep through in my head of anything that was, kind of old. There's only one building I remember is if you take a left on a Solomar where Big Value Outlet is, the corner of Solomar and Dartmouth Street, where the library is. There's a grouping of buildings before it turns onto Prospect Street, because you're forced. It's actually kind of a weird turn, because you turn right and it's Prospect, but if you turn right and left, you go back down Solomar. That's the only really old building that I can remember in that entire neighborhood. And then it isn't until you get up onto Rockland where you see some older homes, single family homes. And then of course they start building up as you're getting into Paidner Village.
Because Paidner Village was originally a village,
Mhm.
and then it became the place where New Bedford families had their summer mansions. Get away from
the heat of the city.
heat of the city.
Wow.
In fact, the trolley system started early in Dartmouth, New Bedford, to get people to Paidner and back.
Okay, so I mean, I know the story of the Union Street Railway. The terminus was, I think, what's that called? Cedar Grove.
I think so.
That's where their line ended and Old Colony picked up, and Cedar Grove was a picnic area, and it was like the whole idea was from Acushnet Park, which I think it predated Acushnet Park, but from the point, Clark's Point, all the way to the Cedar Grove on a Sunday for a nickel. And I guess they were just following the example of the trolley parks across the country, where people were, especially mill workers, were just getting out of the city and, getting dressed up and going out for a Sunday of fun and, picnicking and fresh air. Yeah. Let's see. When it comes down to the arts community, now I've had Ralph Hickok on the show, who's also he.
Oh, I know Ralph.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, I wrote for the Standard Times, and Ralph was the lucky reporter who was assigned to all of the junior writers.
The Cubs.
A long time.
Yeah. So we've had a couple of writers on the show. I mean, I wish I could get more. But let's talk about the literary history, just briefly. Because I'm going to start wrapping this up. The literary history that you're aware of this city. There's historic writers, there are novelists, there's a whole cadre of literary people, correct?
Yeah, there are a lot of historians who did the histories of New Bedford. whose name is escaping me at the moment.
Oh, yeah, the Rickettsons.
I was going to say Daniel Ricketson.
Yeah.
Rickettson's estate is a park now.
Mhm.
You never know that Ricketson had anything to do with it. But it was Ricketson and Ellis and Pease
Yeah.
and a number of writers that no one has heard of today, who actually went to New York and became newspaper writers. And the man who ran the Vineyard Gazette, whose name is escaping me, grew up in New Bedford.
Mm-hmm.
So it does have a sort of a literary history.
Right. I would like to, pursue that a little bit more. I know, for example, I mean, this is like an offshoot, but E.E. Cummings' grandfather, I think, lives in the city. He came into this frequently. He came frequently to visit with him, and and then when we go into the other arts, I mean, again, as with history,
Conrad Aiken.
Yeah.
I mean, his family. He was sent here after the horrible suicide murder of his father and mother.
Wow.
His father killed his mother and then killed himself, and Aiken was sent to New Bedford.
Wow. And again, so much that you could be writing for forever and ever.
I think that's true.
Well, Peggy, it's been fantastic to finally meet with you. At least if not in person, at least online.
By Zooming.
Yeah, and like I said, with my experiences, and then I was always curious as to when you came in to the same sphere, because I left the Office of Historic Preservation and went to work at the then fledgling Fort Tabor Museum, and we both got bit by this bug of history. I mean, it's the information that's in our heads is a little bit more than party talk. It's it's viable history. I hate it when I'm reading a book and I know has something to, that New Bedford had something to do with it, and there's no reference to New Bedford at all.
Mentioned,
yeah. So as a historian, especially, I mean, I always ask the artists, the painters, the plastic arts, how they would like to be remembered. And so as a writer historian or a writer of history, how would you like to be remembered? Because somebody's going to write about you.
I'd like to be remembered for my books, for my work, and the fact that I did care about New Bedford very much and worked in historic preservation to try to save bits and pieces of the city from demolition, which was not easy.
No.
Saving buildings in New Bedford is heartbreaking because often you can't.
One of my last assignments for Tony Souza, and he gave it to me and he said, "I'm giving it to you because I know you can handle it." And it was he was one of the researchers, Michael Daigle, and he became my neighbor, or I became his neighbor. I moved into his neighborhood right across the street, and best friends. And he had us go to South Water Street and all those parallel streets when they took it out for urban renewal. And he said, "Okay, you guys can only save 10 buildings. Well, you can only recommend 10 buildings be saved." He said, "And there's no guarantee if they'll, one of those will actually be saved." And that was really, I mean, we were like, working for Tony, you develop like this X-ray vision. You could see through buildings, like the bones of them. And it was a great job. And then, all those buildings are gone. They're totally wiped out.
I think one or two ended up being moved into the national park. The Haley Luther house was moved.
Yes.
And there's another house on the corner next to it, whose name escapes me. Those two were saved.
Caleb Spooner. Right. And then Alan Scott, who was a classmate of mine at UMass. And that's another story. I really would like to delve into that. But so you will then be immortal as a reference point in
That's
people's
kind of
research.
Nice to think that.
Yeah, you'll be like Ricketson. I mean, when people are doing research, whether it's, regardless of the kind of research, but primarily, obviously, the general historical research, you'll be immortal.
That's kind of nice to think about.
I'm glad I can put it in your head.
It'll get me going to finish this proposal I'm working on.
Good. Oh my God. Only Judge keeps jumping in my head. The Harriet Jacobs story. I wish you a lot of success with that. I hope you can get that regenerated.
Thank you. Well, I know Mike Dyer at the Whaling Museum wants me to do a reading.
Oh, great.
Signing, which would be great.
Yeah, it would be great. I'm looking forward to that.
Mike and I talked about it with the Zoom that we did last week.
Yeah, and that Zoom last week was excellent. That's for sure. Well, Peggy, thank you so much for being a guest. I'm so happy.
I'm thrilled.
The door is always open. If there's something you'd like to speak about, we're not timely, meaning these podcasts are warehoused in case anything happens. And sometimes the cupboard gets near bare and I have to, crank
them out.
Right. But please come back, because especially with insights, I think somebody needs to write the art history of the city of New Bedford. Now, Mary Jean Blasdale, we have had discussions, but I'm talking about it more as an industry
Swain.
Versus
Swain in the industry.
Exactly. So, Peggy, hang on there as I take us out.
Okay, and I will let you cut us off.
Hold on, don't go anywhere. Well, folks, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed listening to Peggi Medeiros, and my God, this is not enough podcast. We need to have Peggy on several more times. There's just so much. And with that in mind, thank you all for joining us. This is Ron Fortier once again, the host of the In Focus podcast, brought to you by the Southcoast Artist Index and sponsored by Heavenly Spirits Import Company. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and be nice to each other. Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for another episode of the Southcoast Artist Index podcast. The Southcoast Artist Index podcast is brought to you in part by Heavenly Spirits, who invites you to celebrate the art of life and creative communities everywhere. Learn more at heavenlyspirits.com. To learn more about the Southcoast Artist Index, visit theartistindex.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Be the artist you believe you are, and let's take care of each other out there.